Close your eyes and imagine standing on the shore of a Norwegian fjord as mist rises from the cold, dark water. The sun barely crests the horizon, casting long shadows across the mountainous landscape. In the distance, you hear the rhythmic sound of oars cutting through water, and a dragon-headed longship emerges from the fog. The Vikings are coming. Tonight, we journey through 3 centuries of Viking history, from their explosive arrival on the world stage in 793 CE to their gradual transformation into the kingdoms of Scandinavia. This is the story of the Norsemen, seafaring warriors, traders, and explorers who sailed from the frozen north to terrorize, trade with, and ultimately transform medieval Europe. From their raids on monasteries to their discovery of America 500 years before Columbus, from their intricate craftsmanship to their complex mythology, the Vikings left an indelible mark on history that echoes through our modern world. Fact 1. The Viking Age officially began on June 8, 793 CE, when Norse raiders attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of northeastern England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the horror. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The monks were completely unprepared for the ferocity of the attack. Vikings killed some, enslaved others, and carried away the monastery's treasures in their ships. This raid shocked Christian Europe and announced the arrival of a new force that would reshape the medieval world. The Vikings had been sailing and raiding on a smaller scale before Lindisfarne, but this attack on such a prominent religious site marked the beginning of sustained Viking expansion across Europe. For the next 3 centuries, the sight of dragon-headed ships on the horizon would strike terror into coastal communities from Ireland to Constantinople. Fact 2. The word Viking doesn't mean what most people think. It comes from the Old Norse word Vikingur, which meant pirate or raider. To go Viking meant to go on a raiding expedition. Not all Norsemen were Vikings. Most were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and traders who never went raiding. The term Viking specifically referred to those who went on overseas expeditions, whether for raiding, trading, or exploration. In their own time, they called themselves by their tribal or national names, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, or simply Northmen. The romanticized image of all Scandinavians as Vikings is a modern invention. Most Norse people lived peaceful lives working the land and sea, never leaving Scandinavia. The raiders who terrorized Europe were a minority, though a highly visible and impactful one. Today, we use Viking to describe the entire Norse culture of this era, but originally it meant specifically those who went raiding. Fact 3. Vikings did not wear horned helmets, despite what movies and cartoons show. This is one of history's most persistent myths. Archaeological evidence shows Viking helmets were simple, practical designs made of iron or leather, designed to protect the head without unnecessary weight or decoration. Horns would have been impractical in battle, providing handholds for enemies and adding weight without protection. The horned helmet myth comes from 19th-century Romantic nationalism and opera costume designers who thought horns looked dramatic. Some pre-Viking Scandinavian ceremonial items featured horns, and ancient Germanic tribes mentioned by Romans wore horned helmets in rituals, but Vikings in battle wore practical, efficient armor. The iconic horned helmet is pure fiction, yet it's become so associated with Vikings that correcting this misconception feels almost impossible. Fact 4. Viking longships were technological marvels that gave Norse raiders decisive advantages. These shallow draft vessels could navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers, allowing Vikings to strike far inland where other ships couldn't go. The ships were clinker-built, with overlapping planks that made them flexible enough to ride ocean swells without breaking apart. They were fast, reaching speeds of 15 knots under sail. The shallow draft, less than 3 feet when loaded, meant Vikings could beach their ships directly on shores for quick raids and getaways. Ships were light enough to be carried overland between rivers. The dragon heads on the prow were removable, taken off when approaching friendly shores so as not to frighten local spirits. These ships enabled Vikings to raid Paris, navigate Russian rivers to reach Constantinople, cross the North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland, and ultimately reach North America. The longship was the key to Viking success. Fact 5. Vikings discovered America approximately 500 years before Columbus, around the year 1000 CE. Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red, sailed from Greenland and landed in what he called Vinland, probably modern Newfoundland. Archaeological evidence at Longhouses Meadows proves Vikings established a settlement in North America. They encountered native peoples they called Skrælings and engaged in both trade and conflict. However, the Viking presence in North America was brief, lasting perhaps a few decades. The settlement was too far from Scandinavia and Greenland to be sustainable. The native population was larger and more organized than in Greenland or Iceland, and the Vikings lacked the population to maintain distant colonies. They abandoned Vinland, and the discovery was largely forgotten except in Norse sagas. Columbus knew nothing of Vikings in America, making his 1492 voyage an independent discovery from Europe's perspective. Fact 6. Berserkers were elite Viking warriors who fought in a trance-like fury that terrified enemies. The word berserker comes from Old Norse and might mean bear shirt or bear shirt, referring to fighting without armor or wearing bear or wolf skins. Sources describe berserkers as seemingly impervious to pain, fighting with superhuman strength and rage, biting their shields before battle. Modern theories suggest various explanations: ritual consumption of psychoactive mushrooms, self-induced hysteria, or genetic conditions affecting pain perception. Some historians question whether berserkers were as extreme as legends suggest, viewing them as elite warriors whose reputation was deliberately exaggerated for psychological warfare. True or exaggerated, berserkers became legendary symbols of Viking ferocity. To call someone going berserk still means losing control in a rage, a phrase that echoes these Norse warriors across 1,000 years. Fact 7. The Vikings had remarkably democratic assemblies called things, where free men gathered to settle disputes, make laws, and decide important matters. The Althing in Iceland, established in 930 CE, is considered one of the world's oldest parliaments and still exists today. At these assemblies, any free man could speak, present grievances, and participate in decision-making. Disputes were settled through argument and voting rather than authority from above. While not democratic by modern standards, women couldn't participate and slaves had no voice. The thing system was remarkably egalitarian for its time. Complex laws covered everything from property rights to murder compensation to inheritance. Law speakers memorized and recited laws since few were literate. The thing tradition influenced political development in Iceland, Norway, and other Norse territories, contributing to traditions of law and assembly that would influence later European governance. Fact 8. Women in Viking society had more rights and freedoms than most medieval European women. Norse women could own property, inherit wealth, request divorces, and manage households and farms while men were away raiding or trading. Some women were skilled craftspeople, producing textiles that were valuable trade goods. A few women may have been warriors, though this is debated. The famous skeleton found in Birka, Sweden, buried with weapons and military tactics game pieces, was assumed to be male until DNA testing in 2017 revealed it was a woman. Some historians argue this proves female warriors existed, while others suggest alternative explanations. Regardless, Viking Age women clearly had agency unusual for medieval Europe. The goddess Freya was associated with war as well as love and fertility, suggesting female martial power was culturally acceptable. While still a patriarchal society, Viking culture offered women more autonomy than most contemporary civilizations. Fact 9. Vikings were not just raiders but sophisticated traders who established trade routes from Baghdad to North America. They traded furs, amber, ivory, and slaves from the north for silver, silk, spices, and wine from the south. The Varangian routes through Russia connected Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. Viking merchants were respected in Constantinople, where some served in the Varangian Guard, the Byzantine emperor's elite bodyguard. Archaeological finds include Arabic coins in Scandinavia, Scandinavian artifacts in the Middle East, and evidence of complex long-distance trade networks. The stereotypical image of Vikings as mindless raiders oversimplifies reality. Many expeditions were primarily commercial. The same ships that carried warriors on raids also carried merchants and goods. Vikings were pragmatic, they raided when profitable and traded when advantageous. Their maritime skills and geographic reach made them crucial connectors in medieval trade. Fact 10. The Viking city of Hedeby in Denmark was one of medieval Europe's most important trading centers. Located at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, Hedeby connected the Baltic and North Seas and facilitated trade between Scandinavia, Frankish territories, and Slavic lands. At its peak in the 10th century, Hedeby had perhaps 2,000 inhabitants and featured workshops producing goods for export, merchants from distant lands, and wealth that attracted both trade and raids. The city had defensive ramparts, wooden streets, and specialized craft districts. Archaeological excavations reveal cosmopolitan culture with artifacts from across the known world. Hedeby shows Vikings weren't isolated barbarians but participants in international medieval economy. The city was eventually destroyed by Slavic forces in 1066, the same year as the Battle of Hastings, symbolically marking the end of the Viking Age. Fact 11. Vikings practiced human sacrifice as part of their religious rituals. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who encountered Vikings in Russia in 922 CE, described a ship burial where a slave woman was killed to accompany a dead chieftain into the afterlife. The woman volunteered, believing she would serve him in Valhalla. Ibn Fadlan's account, while possibly exaggerated or misunderstood, is corroborated by archaeological evidence of sacrificial burials. The temple at Uppsala in Sweden allegedly held sacrifices every 9 years, offering 9 males of various species including humans, hung in trees. While the extent of human sacrifice is debated, evidence suggests it occurred, particularly for important funerals or during crises. This aspect of Viking culture troubles modern sensibilities but reflects religious beliefs where death was transition rather than ending, and honor in death brought glory in the afterlife. Fact 12. Valhalla, the great hall of the slain, was the Viking heaven for warriors who died in battle. Odin, the All-Father, ruled Valhalla, and the Valkyries, warrior maidens, chose which fallen warriors were worthy. In Valhalla, Einherjar, the honored dead, feasted and fought every day, their wounds healing each night so they could fight again. This eternal battle prepared them for Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world, when they would fight alongside the gods against chaos forces. Not all dead went to Valhalla. Those who died of sickness or old age went to Hell, a cold underworld. Those who died at sea might join the goddess Ran. Valhalla wasn't universal heaven but warrior paradise, reflecting Viking values of courage, combat prowess, and glory in death. The concept of Valhalla encouraged fearlessness in battle, as death fighting meant eternal honor. Fact 13. The blood eagle was allegedly the most brutal Viking execution method, though historians debate whether it was real or legendary. According to sagas, the victim's ribs were cut from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, the lungs pulled out through the opening. This horrific death was supposedly reserved for the worst enemies and oathbreakers. The few accounts that describe blood eagles are vague and possibly metaphorical. Some historians think the blood eagle was saga writers' invention, misunderstanding of poetic descriptions, or real but extremely rare. Others argue archaeological evidence supports its existence. The blood eagle has become legendary regardless, symbolizing Viking brutality in popular imagination. Whether real or myth, it reveals how Viking culture valued honor and viewed betrayal as deserving extreme punishment. The uncertainty surrounding the blood eagle reflects broader challenges in Viking history, where saga legends and historical facts intertwine confusingly. Fact 14. Vikings were remarkably clean by medieval standards, bathing weekly and grooming carefully. Archaeological evidence includes tweezers, razors, combs, and ear cleaners. Norsemen braided their beards and hair. Soap made from animal fat and wood ash was common. Saturday was lagerdager, washing day, a tradition reflected in modern Scandinavian languages where Saturday remains washing day. This cleanliness surprised and impressed foreigners. An Anglo-Saxon writer complained that Norse settlers in England bathed too much and paid too much attention to their appearance, making them irresistibly attractive to English women. This hygiene was practical in cold climates where lice and parasites were dangerous, but it also reflected cultural values about presentation and dignity. The stereotype of filthy barbarians doesn't match archaeological reality. Vikings valued cleanliness, appearance, and personal grooming highly. Fact 15. Viking ships were often burned or buried with their owners in elaborate funeral rituals. High-status individuals were placed in ships along with goods, weapons, animals, and sometimes slaves to serve them in the afterlife. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway contained 2 women, one possibly a queen, along with remarkable preserved artifacts including a cart, sleigh, and tapestries. The Gokstad ship held a wealthy man with weapons, horses, dogs, and a peacock, showing international connections. Some ships were burned while others were buried in mounds. These ship burials required immense resources, representing both religious belief and conspicuous display of wealth and status. The ships symbolized journey to the afterlife. When important leaders died, their communities invested enormous effort to ensure they were honored appropriately and equipped for the next world. Fact 16. The Vikings didn't have nations in the modern sense, but rather a loose collection of chiefdoms, kingdoms, and tribal territories. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden as unified kingdoms emerged only gradually during the Viking Age. Most Vikings identified with local regions and leaders rather than countries. Harald Fairhair supposedly unified Norway around 885 CE, though this unification was fragile and contested. Denmark was unified earlier under Gorm the Old and his son Harald Bluetooth in the 10th century. Sweden remained fragmented longest, with competing kingdoms until the medieval period. This political fragmentation actually facilitated Viking expansion, as ambitious men who couldn't gain power at home went abroad seeking wealth and glory. The lack of central authority meant there was no single Viking policy. Different groups pursued different strategies. Danes focused on England, Norwegians on Scotland and Ireland, Swedes on eastern routes. Fact 17. Runes were the writing system used by Vikings and other Germanic peoples, but literacy was not widespread. The runic alphabet called the Futhark had 24 characters in its older version and 16 in the younger Futhark used during the Viking Age. Runes were angular, designed to be carved into wood, bone, or stone rather than written with ink. Most runic inscriptions are short: names, ownership marks, memorials, curses, and magical formulas. Long texts are rare. Literacy was limited to specialized rune masters and some elites. Most Vikings were illiterate, relying on oral tradition for history, law, and poetry. Runes had magical associations, with some believing properly carved runes could bring luck, protection, or power. The word rune itself means secret or mystery. After Christianization, runes were gradually replaced by the Latin alphabet, though they persisted longest in Sweden, where runic inscriptions continued into the 14th century. Fact 18. The sagas, long prose narratives about Viking Age heroes and families, are invaluable historical sources but must be used carefully. Most sagas were written in the 13th and 14th centuries in Iceland, 200 to 300 years after the events they describe. They contain historical facts mixed with legend, exaggeration, and literary invention. The most famous, like Njál's saga and Egil's saga, are masterpieces of medieval literature, featuring complex characters, political intrigue, feuds, and explorations of fate and honor. However, they reflect the Christian medieval society of their authors as much as pagan Viking Age they describe. Historians must corroborate saga accounts with archaeology and contemporary sources. The sagas show how Vikings were remembered and how later generations constructed Viking identity, which is historically valuable even when factual accuracy is uncertain. They preserve oral traditions that might otherwise be lost while embodying literary artistry. Fact 19. Vikings settled Iceland beginning around 870 CE, establishing a society that preserved Old Norse language and culture better than anywhere else. Iceland had no indigenous population, allowing Norse settlers to create society from scratch. They established the Althing in 930 CE and created a commonwealth without kings, governed by chieftains and law. Iceland became a center of saga writing and historical preservation. The harsh environment prevented large-scale agriculture but supported sheep farming and fishing. Icelandic society was relatively egalitarian compared to stratified European kingdoms. The isolation preserved Old Norse language, making modern Icelandic the closest living language to Old Norse. Icelanders can read medieval sagas with less difficulty than English speakers reading Chaucer. Iceland's literary culture during the medieval period was extraordinary for such a small, remote population, producing a disproportionate amount of Norse literature and historical writing. Fact 20. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, explored and settled Greenland around 985 CE, giving it an optimistic name to attract settlers. Greenland was actually greener during the medieval warm period than today, but still harsh. Norse settlers established two main settlements on Greenland's southern and western coasts, farming, hunting seals, and trading walrus ivory. The Greenland colony lasted nearly 500 years before mysteriously dying out around 1450 CE. Theories for the collapse include climate change as the Little Ice Age made farming impossible, loss of trade connections with Europe, conflict with Inuit populations, and religious isolation as the Catholic Church lost contact with this remote outpost. Archaeological evidence shows the last settlers were malnourished and struggling before the colony vanished. Eric the Red's Greenland represents both Viking ambition to settle the most marginal environments and the fragility of colonies in harsh conditions. Fact 21. The Great Heathen Army invaded England in 865 CE, marking a shift from raiding to conquest. This large Viking force, possibly led by the sons of legendary Ragnar Lothbrok seeking revenge for their father's death, wasn't just raiding for treasure but aiming to conquer kingdoms and settle land. Over the following years, the great heathen army conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, nearly destroying Anglo-Saxon England. Only Wessex under Alfred the Great survived. The invasion established the Danelaw, the region of England under Danish law and control. This represented a new phase of Viking expansion, from hit-and-run raids to permanent conquest and colonization. Many Vikings settled as farmers in the Danelaw, their descendants eventually assimilating into English society but leaving lasting impact on English language, place names, and law. The Great Heathen Army showed Vikings could organize large military operations and establish lasting political control. Fact 22. Alfred the Great of Wessex was the only English king to earn the title the Great, largely because he successfully resisted Viking conquest. When most of England fell to the Great Heathen Army, Alfred retreated to marshes, conducted guerrilla warfare, and eventually defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in 878 CE. The resulting Treaty of Wedmore established boundaries between Anglo-Saxon and Danish territory, creating the Danelaw. Alfred built fortified towns called Buzz, reorganized military service, and built a navy to counter Viking ships. He promoted literacy, translated important Latin works into English, and established legal codes. His resistance saved Anglo-Saxon England from complete conquest and created basis for eventual English unification. Alfred demonstrated that Vikings could be defeated through determined resistance, good leadership, and military innovation. His legacy influenced how later generations remembered both Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. Fact 23. The Danelaw was the region of England under Danish law after the Treaty of Wedmore in 878 CE, covering roughly the northern and eastern portions of England. In the Danelaw, Danish law, customs, and language predominated. The region became culturally hybrid, mixing Norse and Anglo-Saxon elements. Place names ending in by, Thorpe, and Toft indicate Viking settlement. Words borrowed from Old Norse entered English, including they, them, their, sky, egg, knife, and hundreds more. The Danelaw shows Vikings weren't just destructive raiders but settlers who integrated into local societies. Many Danes converted to Christianity, married Anglo-Saxons, and gradually assimilated over generations. However, tensions remained, and English kings gradually reconquered the Danelaw during the 10th century. The cultural and linguistic impact lasted far longer than political independence, permanently altering English language and culture. Fact 24. The Varangian Guard was an elite unit of the Byzantine Empire's army composed largely of Norse warriors. Scandinavians traveled down Russian rivers to Constantinople seeking service with the wealthy Byzantine emperors. These Varangians, as they were called in Greek sources, were prized for their fierce loyalty, martial skill, and lack of local political connections. The Guard served as the emperor's personal bodyguard from the 10th through 14th centuries. Service in the Varangian Guard was prestigious and profitable. Norsemen could earn substantial wealth before returning home. Harald Hardrada, who later became king of Norway and fought at Stamford Bridge in 1066, served in the Varangian Guard. Runic inscriptions in Hagia Sophia carved by bored Varangian guards survive today. The Guard shows how Viking martial culture found outlets beyond raids, with Norse warriors serving as elite mercenaries in the Mediterranean world. Fact 25. Vikings established kingdoms in Ireland and ruled Dublin and other cities for nearly 2 centuries. The Norse Gaelic Kingdom of Dublin, founded in 841 CE, became a major slave trading center. Vikings intermarried with Irish, creating a distinct Norse-Gaelic culture. These Hiberno-Norse kingdoms were eventually conquered by Irish kings in the 11th century, but Viking influence left lasting marks. Many Irish coastal cities including Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick were founded by Vikings. Irish art absorbed Norse motifs. Irish history became intertwined with Norse, with Irish and Norse rulers forming shifting alliances against common enemies. The stereotype of Vikings only destroying is challenged by their urban development in Ireland. They founded Ireland's first true towns, which became centers of trade and craftsmanship. Viking Ireland shows how Norse colonization could stimulate urban and economic development. Fact 26. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 were descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France. In 911 CE, the French king granted land in what became Normandy to Viking leader Rollo in exchange for his loyalty and defense against other raiders. The Normans adopted French language, Christianity, and feudal customs while retaining Norse martial prowess and administrative skill. Within 150 years, they had become French in culture, yet their Viking heritage showed in their military effectiveness and ambition. William the Conqueror's invasion of England in 1066 was essentially a Viking raid writ large, though conducted by Christianized French-speaking Normans. The Norman conquest profoundly changed English history, language, and culture. That a Viking descendant conquered England through sophisticated military operation shows how Viking culture could adapt and transform while retaining certain core characteristics. Fact 27. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, just days before the Battle of Hastings, marked the end of the Viking Age in England. Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded England with 300 ships, claiming the throne. King Harold Godwin's son marched north and defeated the Norse army decisively on September 25, 1066. Harald Hardrada died in battle, along with most of his army. So devastating was the defeat that only 24 ships were needed to carry survivors home. Harold Godwinson's victory seemed to end Viking threats to England permanently. However, his army was exhausted and depleted, and he had to immediately march south to face William the Conqueror's Norman invasion. 3 weeks later, Harold died at Hastings. The irony is profound. Harold defeated the last great Viking invasion only to be defeated by Vikings' descendants. Stamford Bridge represents the end of one era and the beginning of another. Fact 28. Vikings traveled far beyond Europe, reaching as far as Baghdad and possibly even further. Swedish Vikings called Russ traveled down the Volga and Dnieper rivers, establishing trading posts and eventually the foundation of what became Russia. The word Russia likely derives from Rus, the Slavic name for these Swedish Vikings. Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan encountered and described Rus traders on the Volga in 922 CE, providing invaluable first-hand account of Viking customs, appearance, and behavior. Archaeological evidence includes thousands of Arabic coins found in Scandinavia, proof of extensive Eastern trade. The Rus established principalities in Novgorod and Kiev, gradually assimilating into Slavic population but leaving their name on the nation. This eastern expansion was primarily commercial rather than raiding, showing Viking adaptability. They were as skilled at navigating complex diplomatic and trade relationships as they were at raiding. Fact 29. Viking ships were not just military vessels but representations of prestige, power, and artistic achievement. Shipbuilding required enormous resources, skilled craftsmen, and access to tall, straight trees for masts and planks. A longship might require 40 oak trees just for the hull. Ships were decorated elaborately with carved dragon heads, painted shields hung along the rails, and colorful sails. Owning a ship demonstrated wealth and status. Ships were so valued they were sometimes buried with owners or burned in funeral pyres. The Oseberg ship, discovered in 1904, shows extraordinary craftsmanship with intricate carvings. Building, maintaining, and crewing ships required community cooperation and resources. The ship was central to Norse identity, religion, and mythology. The gods themselves had magical ships, and the world would end with gods sailing to final battle. No object better represents Viking culture than the longship. Fact 30. The Vikings worshipped a pantheon of gods led by Odin, the one-eyed All-Father, god of wisdom, war, and death. Thor, the thunder god with his hammer Mjolnir, was perhaps more popular among common people, protecting humanity and maintaining order. Freyr and Freya were fertility deities associated with prosperity and love. Loki was the trickster whose mischief would ultimately bring about Ragnarok. Norse religion had no central doctrine, holy book, or organized clergy. Worship was practical and transactional, offering sacrifices for divine favor. Different gods suited different needs. Warriors prayed to Odin, farmers to Thor, lovers to Freya. The mythology, preserved primarily in Icelandic sources written after Christianization, presents complex narratives about creation, the 9 worlds connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree, and the inevitable doom of Ragnarok. Norse mythology influenced Tolkien, Marvel Comics, and countless modern fantasy works. Fact 31. Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, was inevitable and even the gods would die. This concept of prophesied doom was unusual in ancient religions. Ragnarok would begin with Fimbulwinter, 3 years of harsh winter. Wolves would swallow the sun and moon. The great serpent Jormungandr and the wolf Fenrir would break free. Loki would lead giants and the dead from Hel in ships to attack Asgard. Gods and heroes would fight, with Odin devoured by Fenrir, Thor killing Jormungandr but dying from its poison, and most gods falling. The world would burn and sink into the sea. Yet after destruction, the world would rise again, green and renewed, with surviving gods and 2 human survivors repopulating the earth. This cyclical mythology, accepting that nothing lasts forever, reflects Norse realism about fate. Even gods couldn't escape destiny. Courage meant facing inevitable doom with dignity. Fact 32. The Viking diet was surprisingly varied and nutritious. They ate fish, seals, whales, and seafood from the ocean, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens from farms, wild game including deer, elk, and birds, dairy products like milk, butter, and cheese, grains including barley, oats, and rye baked into bread or cooked as porridge, vegetables including onions, cabbage, peas, and beans, berries, nuts, and honey, and preserved foods through salting, smoking, and drying for winter. They drank ale, mead, and imported wine for the wealthy. The diet varied by region and season, with coastal communities eating more fish and inland farms more meat and grain. Feasts for celebrations featured roasted meats, imported delicacies, and abundant alcohol. While not exotic by modern standards, the Viking diet provided adequate nutrition for their active lifestyle. Archaeological analysis of bones shows Vikings were generally healthy and well-fed. Fact 33. Skalds were Viking poets who composed intricate verses praising leaders, commemorating events, and preserving history. Unlike sagas written in prose, skaldic poetry used complex meters, intricate alliteration, and kennings, metaphorical compound words like whaleroad for sea or battleflame for sword. Skalds memorized and performed poetry at feasts and gatherings. Many skalds were also warriors who composed verses about their own exploits. The best skalds gained fame, wealth, and positions in royal courts. Their poems, passed down orally and later written in Iceland, preserve historical information not found elsewhere. However, skaldic poetry is notoriously difficult to translate, as intricate wordplay and cultural references don't transfer easily to other languages. The skalds show that Vikings valued eloquence and artistic skill alongside martial prowess. A warrior who could compose clever poetry commanded respect in ways a simple fighter couldn't. Fact 34. The Thing meetings weren't just for law but also social occasions where scattered farming communities gathered annually or semi-annually. People traveled from across regions to attend. Along with legal proceedings, things featured markets, games, storytelling, marriage arrangements, and feasts. Young people met potential spouses. Merchants sold goods. News and stories spread. The Thing reinforced social bonds in societies where people lived isolated on scattered farms. Iceland's Althing lasted 2 weeks, with people camping at Thingvellir. The social aspect was as important as the legal business. Thing meetings helped maintain cultural cohesion in Norse society despite the lack of central government. They were part court, part parliament, part fair, and part festival, serving multiple functions that brought communities together regularly. Fact 35. Vikings practiced various forms of divination and magic called seer. This shamanic practice, associated primarily with women though some men practiced it, involved trance states, prophecy, and attempts to influence fate. Seer practitioners called Valvas or Sikener traveled between communities performing rituals, telling fortunes, and providing magical services. The practice had ambiguous status, respected for its power but also viewed as somewhat shameful for men, possibly because it involved passivity and femininity. Even Odin practiced seer, learning from the goddess Freya, though this made him subject to mockery from other gods. After Christianization, seer was condemned as witchcraft and suppressed. Our knowledge comes primarily from sagas written by Christian authors who viewed it as pagan superstition. Seer represents the mystical, spiritual side of Viking culture, a contrast to the martial image most people envision. Fact 41. Christianity gradually replaced Norse paganism between the 9th and 12th centuries, though the process was complex and often forced. Some Vikings converted for practical reasons like trade access or political alliances. Others were forcibly converted by missionary kings who used Christianity to consolidate power. Iceland converted peacefully in 1000 CE when the Althing voted to adopt Christianity while allowing private pagan worship. Norway's conversion was violent under Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, who destroyed pagan temples and killed those refusing baptism. Denmark converted under Harald Bluetooth around 965 CE, marked by the famous Jelling Stone. Sweden held out longest, with pagan practices continuing into the 12th century. The transition wasn't clean, many practiced both religions, hedging spiritual bets. Pagan practices and beliefs persisted in folklore long after official Christianization. The conversion changed Viking society fundamentally, integrating Scandinavia into Christian Europe and ending the Viking Age. Fact 42. Thralls were slaves in Viking society, captured in raids or born into slavery. They had no legal rights and were considered property. Thralls did the hardest labor, farming, building, rowing ships, and heavy work. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed by owners, though some sources suggest limits on arbitrary cruelty. However, thralls weren't necessarily permanent condition. Some earned or were granted freedom, becoming freedmen, though still of lower status than freeborn. Children of thralls inherited slave status unless freed. The prevalence of slavery in Viking society is uncomfortable modern reality. Much Viking wealth came from slave trading, and their economy depended on slave labor. This harsh truth contradicts romanticized Viking image. Understanding Viking slavery is essential to honest historical assessment, neither ignoring their achievements nor excusing their participation in one of humanity's most cruel institutions. Fact 43. The Danelaw's legal legacy influenced English common law development. Danish legal concepts merged with Anglo-Saxon traditions, creating hybrid systems. The word law itself derives from Old Norse lagu. Concepts of jury trial and the idea that law comes from community agreement rather than solely from rulers may have Norse influences. The Thing tradition of assembly justice influenced how English communities administered law. While drawing direct lines is difficult, the Danelaw period represented a crucial moment when different legal traditions coexisted and influenced each other. English common law's emphasis on precedent and community standards may owe something to Norse legal culture. The Vikings' indirect contribution to English legal tradition is one of their lesser-known but significant legacies, showing influence extended beyond language and genetics to fundamental institutions. Fact 44. Viking Age Scandinavia wasn't culturally uniform but featured regional variations. Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes had distinct dialects, customs, and historical trajectories. Danish Vikings focused primarily on England and Western Europe. Norwegian Vikings colonized Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and attempted North America. Swedish Vikings dominated eastern routes through Russia to Byzantium and Baghdad. While sharing language, religion, and general culture, these groups sometimes fought each other as often as they cooperated. A Danish Viking in England might have little knowledge of Swedish activities in Russia. The idea of unified Viking culture is partly modern construction. Vikings themselves identified more with region, kin group, and leader than with being Norse or Viking. The diversity within Viking culture reminds us not to overgeneralize about such complex societies. Fact 45. The Longships' shallow draft enabled surprise attacks far inland via rivers. Vikings raided Paris by sailing up the Seine, besieging the city in 845 CE. Charles the Bald paid £7,000 of silver to make them leave, establishing precedent of buying off Vikings. They returned multiple times, with major sieges in 885 to 886 CE. Vikings similarly raided up the Loire, Rhine, and other rivers, striking targets thought safe from sea raiders. This riverine capability extended Viking reach far beyond coasts, allowing attacks on wealthy inland cities. Defensive measures eventually included blocking rivers with fortifications and bridges, but Viking adaptability remained fearsome. The ability to transition seamlessly from ocean to river navigation gave Vikings strategic advantages that terrified medieval Europe. No target was truly safe if accessible by water. Fact 46. Hnefatafl was a popular Viking strategy board game, played on a grid with a king piece and defenders trying to escape while attackers attempted to capture the king. The game appears in sagas as entertainment for nobles and common pastime. Archaeological finds include Hnefatafl boards and pieces from across the Viking world. The game required strategic thinking and planning, suggesting Vikings valued intelligence alongside martial prowess. Hnefatafl tournaments were held at thing meetings and feasts. Some scholars suggest the game trains strategic thinking useful in warfare. Unlike chess, which arrived later, Hnefatafl was native to Norse culture. The game's presence in burials, including the Gokstad ship, shows it was valued enough to accompany the dead into the afterlife. Modern reconstructions show Hnefatafl is genuinely challenging, not merely ancient curiosity but sophisticated strategy game. Fact 47. Viking navigation was remarkably sophisticated despite lacking compasses or detailed maps. They used sunstones, possibly Iceland spar crystals that can locate the sun even through clouds by showing polarized light. They observed birds, wave patterns, water color, and sea life. Coastal navigation used landmarks memorized and passed down through oral tradition. Open ocean navigation required observations of stars, sun angles, and understanding of seasonal wind patterns. Vikings developed mental maps through experience, knowing landmarks, currents, and typical conditions. The sun compass, a wooden disc with a gnomon, helped navigate on sunny days. This navigation skill enabled voyages across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and North America. Modern experiments reconstructing Viking navigation techniques show they were effective, enabling reliable transatlantic crossings without modern instruments. Fact 48. The Vinland sagas, Saga of Eric the Red and Saga of the Greenlanders, describe Norse exploration of North America around the year 1000 CE. While written centuries after events and containing legendary elements, archaeological evidence at Lonsaux Meadows proves Vikings reached North America. The sagas describe three main areas: Helgeland, Stone Slab Land, probably Baffin Island, Markland, Forest Land, probably Labrador, and Vinland, Wineland, probably Newfoundland. The name Vinland is puzzling since grapes don't grow that far north, leading to theories the name meant grassland or was wishful marketing. The sagas mention battles with native people called Skrælings. The Norse settlement was brief, perhaps a few decades, before being abandoned. Distance from Greenland, hostile natives, and small population made permanent colonization impossible. Had circumstances differed, history might have included a lasting Norse presence in North America. Fact 49. The burial ship at Sutton Hoo in England, though from the early 7th century before the Viking Age, shows how ship burials reflected Germanic and Scandinavian cultural traditions. The massive ship contained rich grave goods including weaponry, armor, gold and silver artifacts, and Byzantine silver. Whether Viking-era Scandinavians continued this tradition or independently developed it is debated, but clear cultural continuity exists. The elaborate ship burials like Oseberg, Gokstad, and Sutton Hoo show that ships symbolized status, wealth, and passage to the afterlife across Germanic cultures. These burials required immense resources and community labor, demonstrating social hierarchies and belief in material afterlife. The ships, practical vessels in life, became spiritual vessels in death, carrying the deceased on their final journey. This symbolism was so powerful that even after Christianization, ships remained important motifs in Scandinavian culture. Fact 50. The climate during the early Viking Age was relatively warm, facilitating navigation and settlement in marginal regions like Iceland and Greenland. This medieval warm period, roughly 950–1250 C, meant Greenland was indeed greener and more habitable. The North Atlantic had less sea ice, making voyages easier. This warming enabled Norse expansion northward and westward. However, the subsequent Little Ice Age, beginning around 1300 CE, made these colonies increasingly difficult. Greenland's Norse settlements failed as temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened, and sea ice expanded. The climate influence on Viking expansion and contraction shows how environmental factors shaped historical events. Vikings weren't just driven by culture and economics but also by climate conditions that made certain activities possible or impossible. The end of the medieval warm period contributed to ending Viking expansion and ultimately the Viking Age itself. As you relax into this moment, imagine standing on a windswept beach in Norway as the last light fades from the northern sky. The aurora borealis begins to dance across the darkness, green and white curtains of light flowing across the stars. You hear the distant sound of a skull chanting verses, the crackle of a fire, and the gentle lap of waves against the shore. The air smells of wood smoke, salt water, and the pine forests that cover the mountains. The Vikings believed these northern lights were reflections of the Valkyries' armor as they rode across the sky choosing the slain. Let this image gently fade as you sink deeper into rest. Fact 51. Vikings' daily lives were governed by seasons and daylight. In Scandinavia's far north, summer brought endless daylight while winter brought endless darkness. This extreme seasonal variation shaped culture, economics, and psychology. Summer was for raiding, trading, farming, and building, with long days allowing intensive work. Winter was for indoor crafts, storytelling, and maintenance work. The long dark winters encouraged rich oral traditions as people gathered around fires, telling sagas, myths, and histories. Seasonal festivals marked agricultural and astronomical events. The Norse calendar divided into 2 seasons, summer and winter, with subsidiary seasons. This adaptation to harsh northern environment shaped Viking character. Their expansion southward brought them to regions with more moderate climates and longer growing seasons, one reason why settling in England and France became attractive. Fact 52. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 CE, though occurring in Ireland, represented a significant moment in Viking history. Brian Boru, Irish High King, defeated a coalition including Viking forces from Dublin and Leinster. The battle broke Viking power in Ireland, though it didn't end their presence. Brian Boru died in battle but won a victory that ended Viking military dominance over Irish kingdoms. The battle is often portrayed as Irish versus Vikings, but reality was more complex, with Vikings and Irish on both sides fighting in shifting alliances. Clontarf represented the mature Viking Age when Norsemen had lived in Ireland for generations, intermarried with Irish, and become part of complex Irish political landscape. The battle's significance is partly symbolic, representing Irish resistance to foreign rule while acknowledging that foreign and native had become increasingly mixed. Fact 53. Beowulf, though written in Old English, contains themes and settings from Scandinavian world. The hero Beowulf is a Geat, from southern Sweden, who travels to Denmark to help the Danish king Hrothgar fight the monster Grendel. The poem reflects shared Germanic culture that included Angles, Saxons, and Scandinavians before their divergence. Many characters and events in Beowulf correspond to Norse legendary history. The poem shows cultural connections across the North Sea. Beowulf was probably composed before the Viking Age but transmitted orally until being written down around 1000 CE, during the Viking period. The poem provides insight into Germanic warrior culture that Vikings shared, including values of loyalty, courage, generosity, and reputation. Beowulf reminds us that Vikings weren't isolated culture but part of broader Germanic world with shared traditions and legends. Fact 54. The Ulfert swords found throughout Viking territories were remarkably advanced weapons, made with steel technology that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. These swords, marked with the inscription +, contained high-carbon steel that required advanced metallurgy. Scholars debate whether they were imported from Middle East or produced in the Rhineland. Either way, Vikings acquired and used weapons more advanced than most European contemporary blades. The technology for making such steel was kept secret, making Ulfbert swords extremely valuable. Owning one marked status and wealth. The swords show Vikings' access to international trade networks and their appreciation for quality craftsmanship. The fact that modern smiths struggle to replicate Ulfbert swords using period techniques demonstrates remarkable medieval metallurgical knowledge that was subsequently lost. Fact 55. Harald Bluetooth, King of Denmark around 958 to 986 CE, converted Denmark to Christianity and is credited with unifying the country. The Jelling Stone, erected by Harald, proclaims Harald who won for himself all Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The stone features elaborate carved decoration mixing pagan and Christian iconography. Harald fortified Denmark with a network of circular fortresses and built the first bridge at Ravning Enge, showing administrative and engineering capabilities. Ironically, despite converting to Christianity, Harald's name lives on through modern technology. Bluetooth wireless technology is named after him, and the Bluetooth logo combines the runes for his initials H and B. This connection honors Harald's role in connecting and unifying, paralleling how Bluetooth technology connects devices. Few medieval kings have their name used billions of times daily by people worldwide. Fact 56. Sklenir, Odin's magical ship in Norse mythology, could be folded up and carried in a pocket when not in use but was large enough to carry all the Aesir gods when unfolded. This fantastic vessel represents the Norse fascination with ships and their importance in culture and mythology. Gods themselves depended on ships. During Ragnarok, the dead would sail to final battle in the ship Naglfar, made from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, a gruesome detail showing Norse preoccupation with death and ships. The ship as mystical object, as living thing with spirit and power, reflects how central ships were to Norse identity. The reverence for ships in mythology mirrors their practical importance for survival, trade, and expansion. When land was harsh and scattered, the sea connected communities, making ships not just transport but lifelines and symbols of freedom. Fact 57. The Vinland map, supposedly a 15th century map showing Viking exploration of North America, was exposed as a 20th century forgery through chemical analysis. This hoax shows how Viking history attracts interest and occasionally fraud. The authentic Viking connection to America has been proven through archaeology at Lonsaux Meadows, but the Vinland map represented an attempt to provide cartographic evidence. Its exposure as fraud actually strengthened legitimate Viking scholarship by showing that authentic evidence could be distinguished from fakes. The incident reminds us that historical claims require careful scrutiny. Vikings' genuine achievements are remarkable enough without requiring invented evidence. The public fascination that makes fake Viking artifacts profitable also shows enduring interest in Norse exploration and culture. Proper scholarship must navigate between dismissing genuine evidence and accepting frauds. Fact 58. Viking kings and jarls maintained retinues of professional warriors called housecarls or heer who swore loyalty in exchange for food, shelter, weapons, and share of plunder. These warriors formed the nucleus of armies, supplemented by levies of free farmers who owed military service. The housecarl relationship was formalized through oath-taking ceremonies and gift exchange. A lord provided weapons, armor, and hospitality, warriors provided military service and loyalty. This arrangement created bonds of mutual obligation. Breaking these bonds was dishonorable and dangerous. The system parallels later feudalism but operated more personally and less hierarchically. Housecarls were companions and advisors as well as warriors. The relationship was celebrated in poetry and saga, with legendary warriors gaining fame through service to great leaders. These military households were centers of warrior culture, training, storytelling, and male bonding. Fact 59. The Oseberg ship burial, discovered in 1904 in Norway, contained 2 women, one possibly Queen Asa of Agder. The burial included extraordinarily well-preserved artifacts, a ornately carved ship, a cart, sleighs, beds, chests, looms, kitchen equipment, and textiles. The preservation in blue clay allowed wooden artifacts to survive intact. The grave goods show high-status women's lives, including domestic items but also wealth and artistry. One woman may have been a queen, the other possibly a servant sacrificed to accompany her. The Oseberg burial demonstrates that Viking Age women could hold high status and be honored with elaborate funerals. The ship and goods represent enormous wealth and effort, proving not all ship burials were for men. The Oseberg finds are now displayed in Oslo's Viking Ship Museum, offering tangible connection to Viking Age elite culture. Fact 60. Leif Erikson Day, celebrated on October 9 in the United States, honors the Norse explorer who reached North America around 1000 CE. The holiday was promoted by Norwegian American communities and officially recognized in 1964. October 9 was chosen to commemorate the arrival of the ship Restoration in New York in 1825, bringing Norwegian immigrants to America. Leif Erikson Day represents Scandinavian American heritage and acknowledges Norse exploration of America before Columbus. While less widely celebrated than Columbus Day, it has gained recognition as an alternative celebrating exploration without the problematic colonial legacy of Columbus. The holiday shows how Viking history remains relevant to modern American culture, particularly for the millions of Americans with Scandinavian ancestry who claim Vikings as cultural heritage. Fact 61. Viking Age art featured intricate knotwork, intertwined animals, and geometric patterns that influenced later European art. The distinct Viking art styles evolved over 2 centuries, showing cultural development and change. These styles influenced Romanesque art in Europe, particularly in regions Vikings settled. Animal motifs, interlaced patterns, and ribbon-like decoration became characteristic. Viking artistry wasn't just decorative but conveyed meanings related to mythology, protection, and status. Rune stones combined carved images with inscriptions, creating visual textual art. The gelling style, named after Harold Bluetooth's monuments, became especially widespread. This artistic tradition continued evolving after Christianization, with Viking aesthetic sensibilities blending into medieval Scandinavian art. Modern revivals of Viking art in tattoos, jewelry, and design show lasting appeal of these interlocking patterns and stylized animals, connecting contemporary culture to ancient Norse traditions. Fact 62. The Bluetooth technology logo combines 2 Norse runes, Hagal, for H and Jarkin, for B, Harold Bluetooth's initials. The technology was named during 1990s development when Jim Kardak, an Intel engineer, read about Harold Bluetooth's unification of Denmark and Norway. He saw parallel to Bluetooth technology unifying communication protocols. The temporary codename became permanent brand. Modern technology named after a 10th-century Viking king shows cultural impact extending far beyond the Viking Age. Every Bluetooth device sold carries these runes, making them possibly the most widely distributed runic inscriptions in history. Harold Bluetooth, who died over 1,000 years ago, has his name and symbol used billions of times daily worldwide. This peculiar immortality through technology naming was surely unimaginable to medieval Danes. Fact 63. The Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, collected in Iceland in the 13th century, preserve Norse mythology that otherwise might have been lost. Snorri Sturluson compiled the Prose Edda as a handbook for poets, explaining mythological references and providing systematic account of Norse gods and cosmology. The Poetic Edda is older collection of anonymous poems about gods and heroes. Together, these texts preserve mythology from oral traditions extending back to Viking Age and earlier. They describe cosmology with 9 worlds, the gods and their adventures, creation myths, and prophecies of Ragnarok. Without these Icelandic texts, written after Christianization, Norse mythology would survive only in fragments. Snorri and other saga writers preserved pagan traditions even while being Christian, showing respect for cultural heritage. Modern knowledge of Odin, Thor, Loki, and Norse myths depends almost entirely on these medieval Icelandic sources. Fact 64. Viking Age Scandinavia had social classes but more mobility than feudal Europe. At the top were jarls, aristocrats, and leaders. Most people were carls, free farmers and craftsmen who owned land and participated in things. At the bottom were thralls, slaves with no rights. However, boundaries were somewhat permeable. Successful raiding could elevate a carl to jarl status. Freed thralls became freedmen, low status but free. This mobility contrasted with more rigid feudal hierarchies developing elsewhere in Europe. A free man could theoretically rise through military prowess, trading success, or political skill. This relative mobility encouraged ambition and risk-taking, perhaps contributing to Viking expansion. Why settle for small farm in Norway when raiding and trading offered possibilities for wealth and status? The social structure channeled ambition outward into exploration, conquest, and colonization. Fact 65. The Great Army that invaded England in 865 CE was called Great because it was unusually large and organized. Typically, Viking raids involved a few ships and dozens or hundreds of men hitting targets and leaving quickly. The Great Heathen Army numbered thousands and stayed for years, methodically conquering kingdoms. This represented evolution from raiding to conquest, from temporary plunder to permanent settlement. The shift happened throughout Viking world around this time, with raiders becoming settlers in Ireland, Scotland, Russia, and elsewhere. The transition from Viking raiding to settlement changed European history, as Norse populations integrated into local societies, contributing genes, language, and culture. The Viking invasions ultimately weren't temporary affliction but permanent demographic and cultural change. The Great Heathen Army symbolizes this transformation from raiders to conquerors to settlers to residents. Fact 66. Viking tattoos, so common in modern popular culture, probably didn't exist historically. No archaeological or historical evidence proves Vikings tattooed themselves. The single historical reference comes from Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan describing rust traders with tree patterns and figures from fingernails to neck, but scholars debate whether this describes tattoos, painted designs, or was misunderstood. Vikings did use body decoration, but permanent tattooing evidence is absent. However, many cultures across Eurasia practiced tattooing, so Vikings might have adopted it through cultural contact. The absence of evidence isn't conclusive evidence of absence, but historically aware scholars are skeptical. Modern Viking tattoos are fantasy, though effective for expressing cultural connection. The persistence of this belief despite lack of evidence shows how popular imagination shapes Viking image, sometimes more than historical reality does. Fact 67. The medieval chronicler Adam of Bremen described the temple at Uppsala in Sweden as a magnificent pagan site with hanging sacrifices. According to Adam, every 9 years, a festival involved sacrificing 9 males of every species, their bodies hanging in sacred grove. The temple supposedly held statues of Odin, Thor, and Freyr. However, Adam never visited Uppsala himself and wrote almost a century after Sweden's Christianization, so his account is controversial. Archaeological excavations found a large hall at Uppsala, but evidence for the described temple remains ambiguous. Adam's account may combine truth, hearsay, and Christian propaganda against paganism. Whether accurate or exaggerated, his description influenced how medieval Europeans viewed Norse paganism. The Uppsala temple, real or partially invented, became symbolic of Viking religious practices in European imagination. Separating history from medieval propaganda remains challenging for Viking Age religion. Fact 68. The Danevirke, a massive fortification across the Jutland Peninsula, protected Denmark from invasion from the south. Built in phases from the 5th century onward, the Viking Age saw major expansions creating earth and timber ramparts stretching nearly 20 miles from coast to coast. The fortification showed Vikings could organize large-scale defensive projects requiring coordination, labor, and resources. It protected against Carolingian Frankish expansion, channeling trade and military movements through controlled points. The Danevirke remained significant into the medieval period, modified and reinforced over centuries. Parts still exist today, though many sections were destroyed during 19th century wars. This defensive work shows Viking Age wasn't just offensive expansion but also defensive consolidation, with emerging kingdoms building infrastructure to protect territory. The Danevirke represents Norse engineering on scale rivaling their famous ships. Fact 69. The concept of wergild, monetary compensation for killing someone, was fundamental to Viking law. Each person had a price based on status. Killing a jarl cost more than killing a carl, who cost more than killing a thrall. If someone killed your relative, you could accept wergild or pursue blood feud. The system attempted to limit endless cycles of revenge by providing alternative to feuding. However, disputes over adequate compensation or refusal to pay often led to violence anyway. Legal cases at things often involved negotiating appropriate wergild. The system acknowledged life's value and attempted to channel vengeance into economic compensation. Similar systems existed throughout medieval Europe, but Viking emphasis on legal procedure at things made wergild central to maintaining social order. The alternative to compensatory justice was destructive feuding that could last generations, devastating families and communities. Fact 70. Yggdrasil, the world tree, connected the 9 worlds in Norse cosmology. The great ash tree's roots and branches reached through all reality. The gods met daily at the well Urebrunn beneath Yggdrasil. The Norns, female beings controlling destiny, lived there. Yggdrasil suffered constant assault. The serpent Nhggr gnawed its roots, deer ate its leaves, yet it remained standing through cosmic cycles. At Ragnarok, Yggdrasil would shake violently but ultimately survive. 2 humans hiding in the tree would survive to repopulate the earth after destruction. The world tree represented interconnection of all existence, stability amid chaos, and continuity through catastrophe. This powerful symbol influenced medieval Christian imagery and continues resonating in modern fantasy literature. The image of a cosmic tree connecting worlds and sustaining reality was already ancient when Vikings adopted it, reflecting Indo-European mythological patterns. Fact 71. The Vikings' gradual Christianization created fascinating syncretism, blending old and new beliefs. Conversion wasn't instant transformation but gradual process. Some wore both Thor's hammer and Christian cross pendants, hedging spiritual bets. Christian missionaries sometimes presented Christ as mightiest God who defeated other gods, framing conversion in terms Vikings understood. Churches built on sites of former pagan temples. Christian festivals coincided with pagan holidays. Saints assumed characteristics of gods they replaced. This blending meant Christianity in Scandinavia retained elements of older religion. Folk practices, superstitions, and stories preserved pagan elements long after official conversion. The transition wasn't clean break but evolution, with new religion absorbing and transforming old. This religious flexibility let Vikings maintain cultural continuity while adopting Christianity. The result was distinctly Norse version of Christianity, different from practices in Rome or Constantinople. Fact 72. The Laxdæla saga, one of the longest and most complex Icelandic sagas, tells a multi-generational story centered on Gernasvar's daughter, one of saga literature's most memorable characters. The saga contains love, betrayal, revenge, and tragedy, spanning decades of Icelandic and Norse history. Gern has 4 husbands and complex relationships with men who love her. Her life is marked by prophetic dreams, tragic losses, and ultimately spiritual transformation when she becomes Iceland's first nun. Laxdæla saga shows saga literature's sophistication, with psychological depth, complex characterization, and tragic structure rivaling classical literature. The saga provides insight into medieval Iceland's social structures, legal disputes, and values. That such literature emerged from small, remote Iceland during the medieval period demonstrates remarkable cultural achievement. The sagas remain Iceland's greatest literary legacy and major contribution to world literature. Fact 73. Runestones commemorating the dead were raised throughout Scandinavia, with over 3,000 surviving in Sweden alone. These stones combined carved inscriptions with artistic decoration, serving as memorials and status markers. Typical inscription identified who raised the stone, who died, and sometimes how they died. Many mention sons raising stones for fathers, showing continuity and inheritance. Some stones commemorate warriors who died in foreign lands, maintaining their memory back home. The Jelling stones in Denmark, raised by Harald Bluetooth, are particularly famous, marking Denmark's Christianization. Rune stones provide invaluable historical information about people, places, and events. They show literacy wasn't as rare as once thought, as raising a stone required someone able to compose and carve inscriptions. These stones are Viking Age's most widespread written legacy, silent witnesses scattered across the Scandinavian landscape. Fact 74. The Varangian route from Scandinavia through Russia to Constantinople was one of medieval world's most important trade arteries. Swedish Vikings, called Russ, traveled down rivers including the Volga and Dnieper, portaging between waterways. They established trading posts that became cities like Novgorod and Kiev. The route brought Baltic amber, furs, and slaves south, returning with Arabic silver, Byzantine gold, silk, and spices. The Rus served as intermediaries between northern forests and southern empires. This trade enriched Scandinavian kingdoms and spurred Swedish Viking expansion eastward. The route shows Viking Age's geographic scope, connecting cold Baltic to warm Mediterranean. When Mongols disrupted trade routes in the 13th century, Scandinavia's economy suffered. The Varangian route was Viking Age globalization, connecting distant regions through commerce and cultural exchange. Fact 75. The Viking Age ended gradually rather than suddenly, with 1066 often cited as symbolic end date. The Battle of Stamford Bridge defeated Harald Hardrada's invasion, and the Norman conquest put descendants of Vikings on England's throne. Meanwhile, Scandinavia Christianized, centralized into kingdoms, and integrated into European Christian civilization. The raiding that characterized early Viking Age declined as targets improved defenses, weather patterns changed, and Scandinavian societies transformed. By 1100, the age of Viking raids was over, though Norse cultural influence continued. The end wasn't defeat but transformation, as Vikings evolved from raiders to traders, Christians, and Europeans. The Viking Age concluded, but Viking descendants continued shaping medieval Europe as Normans, Rus, and Scandinavian kingdoms. The culture that exploded violently onto the world stage in 793 CE had, by 1100, been largely absorbed into the medieval European world it had terrorized, traded with, and transformed. Fact 76. Islendingabok, the Book of Icelanders, written around 1130 by Ari Orgilsson, is one of earliest historical writings in vernacular European language rather than Latin. This short text chronicles Iceland's settlement and early history, including the establishment of the Althing and conversion to Christianity. Ari consulted oral sources and written records, attempting accuracy rather than entertainment. Islendingabok shows Iceland's remarkable literary culture, developing historical writing in native language when most European history was written in Latin by clergy. The preservation and creation of historical and literary texts in Old Norse rather than Latin allowed Iceland to maintain linguistic and cultural continuity. This tradition made Iceland the primary source for Norse literature and mythology. Without Icelandic literacy and dedication to preserving tradition, much less would be known about Viking Age culture, religion, and society. Fact 77. The Longships, 5 Viking vessels deliberately sunk around 1070 CE to block a channel near Roskilde, Denmark, were excavated in 1962. The ships represented different types: warships, cargo vessels, and multipurpose boats. The finds provided invaluable information about Viking shipbuilding techniques, construction, and use. Experimental archaeology built full-scale replicas, testing how Viking ships performed. The Longships show not all Viking ships were identical longships. Different designs served different purposes: raiding, trading, fishing, or transport. The ship's deliberate sinking to create blockade shows practical use of valuable vessels for defense when needed. The excavation and subsequent reconstructions demonstrate modern archaeology's power to reveal Viking technology and maritime culture. The Longships are displayed at Roskilde's Viking Ship Museum, allowing visitors to see authentic Viking vessels. Fact 78. Women in Viking society could be poets, religious practitioners, healers, and traders, though primary sources focus mostly on male activities. Saga literature features complex female characters including Gurn, Halger, and Brynhildr. Archaeology reveals women buried with valuable goods, suggesting wealth and status. Some graves contain textile working tools, showing women's crafts were valued. The question of female warriors remains controversial. Most scholars think female warriors were rare exceptions if they existed, while some argue for more widespread female participation in warfare. Regardless, Viking Age women weren't passive or powerless. They managed farms and households during husbands' absences, participated in religious practices, and influenced families' decisions. Legal rights to divorce and property ownership gave them agency unusual for medieval Europe. Viking women were constrained by patriarchy but had more freedom than many contemporaries. Fact 79. The Normans who conquered England, established kingdoms in Sicily, participated in crusades, and influenced medieval Europe were culturally French by 1066 but descended from Vikings who settled Normandy in 911 CE. Within 3 generations, these Norse settlers had adopted French language, Christianity, and Frankish customs. Yet Norman military prowess, administrative efficiency, and ambition show their Viking heritage. They built castles, organized effective governments, and conquered territories from England to Jerusalem. Norman achievements demonstrate how quickly Vikings could adapt to new cultures while retaining certain characteristics. The Normans became vectors spreading Viking influence across Europe through conquest and colonization. That William the Conqueror was both French Duke and Viking descendant symbolizes how Viking Age ended, not with Vikings' destruction but their transformation and integration into European Christian civilization they had once raided. Fact 80. The Christianization of Scandinavia had profound effects beyond religion. The Church brought literacy, Latin learning, and connection to wider European culture. Monasteries became centers of education and writing. The Church's administrative structures influenced governmental development. Christian marriage laws changed family structures. Churches replaced pagan temples as community centers. However, Christianization also meant loss of oral traditions as new religion suppressed old beliefs. Much Norse mythology would be lost except for Icelandic preservation. The change was revolutionary, ending traditional religion practiced for millennia. Yet conversion wasn't entirely external imposition. Some Vikings converted voluntarily, seeing advantages in Christian networks or genuinely embracing new faith. The process was complex negotiation between old and new, resistance and acceptance, creating distinctly Scandinavian Christianity that retained elements of earlier culture. Fact 81. Archaeological excavations at Viking sites reveal details impossible to know from texts alone. House structures, tools, food remains, textiles, and everyday objects show how ordinary Vikings lived. Stable isotope analysis of bones reveals diet, migration patterns, and health. DNA analysis shows population movement and family relationships. Excavations of workshops reveal manufacturing techniques. Port cities like Hedeby and Birka show urban planning and trade networks. Burial sites reveal beliefs about death and afterlife. Material culture preserved archaeologically corrects and enriches textual sources, which focus on elites and dramatic events. Archaeology reveals the 99% of Vikings who never raided, never appeared in sagas, but farmed, fished, crafted, raised families, and lived lives leaving archaeological rather than textual traces. Combining archaeology and texts creates more complete picture than either source alone provides. Fact 82. The Viking diaspora spread Scandinavian DNA across Europe, with genetic legacies remaining today. Studies show Scandinavian ancestry in populations across Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Normandy, Russia, and other areas Vikings settled. In some regions like Iceland, the population is primarily descended from Norse settlers. In others like England, Viking DNA is one component among many. Genetic studies can trace specific migrations and settlements, sometimes confirming or contradicting historical accounts. The genetic legacy shows Vikings weren't just passing through but settled permanently, intermarrying and becoming part of local populations. Modern people with Scandinavian ancestry can sometimes trace lineage to Viking Age populations. This genetic continuity across 1,000 years connects modern descendants directly to Viking ancestors, making Viking history personally relevant to millions worldwide. Fact 83. The Rus Primary Chronicle, written in Kievan Rus around 1113 CE, describes how Scandinavian Vikings called Varangians were invited to rule Slavic tribes. According to the chronicle, local tribes sent message, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." 3 Varangian brothers came, with Rurik becoming Prince of Novgorod. This legendary invitation likely simplifies complex process of Viking integration into Slavic society. Whether invited rulers or conquering warriors, Swedish Vikings definitely established ruling dynasties in Russian territories, giving their name to Russia. The Rurik dynasty ruled Russia for centuries until 1598. The Viking contribution to Russian state formation is significant though controversial, with nationalist historians sometimes minimizing Scandinavian influence. Regardless, the Rus were crucial to connecting Scandinavia and Byzantine Empire through trade and diplomacy. Fact 84. The Viking funeral practices varied by region, status, and period. Cremation was common early in Viking Age, with ashes placed in urns and buried. Inhumation became more common later, possibly due to Christian influence. High-status individuals received elaborate burials with grave goods. Ship burials represented extreme end of funeral extravagance. Poorer Vikings received simpler burials with few or no grave goods. Slaves might be thrown into unmarked graves or bogs. Burial practices reflected beliefs about afterlife and social status. The effort invested in funerals showed respect for dead and demonstrated survivors' wealth and honor. When Christianity became dominant, burial practices changed to match Christian customs, ending cremation and limiting grave goods. The transition in burial practices marks Christianization's progress archaeologically, showing religious change through material culture. Fact 85. The Gesta Danorum, written by Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus around 1200 CE, chronicles Danish history from legendary times through the 12th century. Saxo combined historical events, legendary material, and mythology into narrative history. The work contains the earliest version of the Hamlet story that Shakespeare later adapted. Gesta Danorum provides Danish perspective on Viking Age, though written 2 centuries after it ended. Saxo's work shows how Christian medieval Danes remembered and reconstructed their pagan past, often Christianizing or rationalizing pagan stories. As historical source, Gesta Danorum must be used carefully, separating legend from fact. However, it preserves traditions and stories that supplement Icelandic sources, showing Vikings remembered themselves and were remembered by descendants. Medieval historical writing about Vikings reveals as much about medieval interpretations as about Viking Age itself. Fact 86. Viking military tactics emphasized mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare. They preferred dawn attacks, quick strikes, and rapid withdrawals before defenders could organize. Vikings exploited rivers for deep penetration inland, attacking where unexpected. They used fortified camps for extended campaigns, protected by earthworks and stakes. Shield walls provided strong defensive formation but limited mobility. Vikings adapted tactics to circumstances, guerrilla raids, sieges, set-piece battles, or naval combat. Their success came from combining tactical flexibility, superior ships, effective weapons, motivated warriors, and strategic patience. They would wait for opportunities, withdraw if outnumbered, and return when advantageous. This pragmatism made them dangerous opponents. Vikings weren't invincible, losing battles regularly, but their combination of maritime mobility and tactical flexibility made them formidable throughout the Viking Age. Fact 87. The transition from oral to written culture transformed how Vikings preserved and transmitted knowledge. In oral culture, skalds and storytellers memorized laws, genealogies, poems, and histories, passing them through generations. This required prodigious memory and formulaic composition techniques. Written culture, introduced with Christianity and Latin alphabet, enabled permanent records but changed knowledge's nature. Written laws replaced memorized customs. Sagas written down froze stories previously fluid in oral tradition. Literacy concentrated knowledge among educated clergy and elites, unlike oral tradition accessible to all who could listen. This transition preserved knowledge that might otherwise be lost but also changed it, as oral stories adapted for writing. Understanding Viking Age culture requires recognizing early period was oral culture, with all that implies for how knowledge was created, transmitted, and controlled. Fact 88. The Viking reputation evolved significantly over time. To medieval Christians, Vikings were God's punishment, pagan barbarians terrorizing the faithful. During the Age of Exploration, Vikings became proto-explorers who reached America. In 19th-century Romantic nationalism, they became symbols of Nordic racial superiority and primitive Germanic virtue. In the 20th century, Vikings inspired everything from Wagner's operas to Marvel's Thor. Modern popular culture portrays Vikings variously as noble warriors, brutal savages, or fascinating historical people. Academic Viking studies have matured, presenting more nuanced picture based on archaeology and critical reading of sources. The multiple Vikings, historical reality, medieval memory, nationalist symbol, popular culture icon, coexist and influence each other. How each generation remembers and reimagines Vikings reveals as much about that generation's values and concerns as about historical Vikings themselves. Fact 89. Viking Age women's lives are harder to reconstruct than men's because sources focused on male activities, particularly warfare. However, careful reading of sagas, law codes, and archaeological evidence reveals women's agency and importance. Women managed households and farms, which were economic units requiring skilled management. Textile production was primarily women's work and economically crucial, producing trade goods and clothing. Some women practiced seer and had religious authority. A few may have participated in warfare, though this remains controversial. Women could own property, inherit wealth, and divorce husbands. Archaeological burials show wealthy women were honored in death with grave goods demonstrating their status. While Viking society was patriarchal, women weren't powerless or invisible. Recovering women's history requires reading between lines of male-focused sources and using archaeology to supplement texts. Fact 90. The Viking impact on European languages extends beyond English to French, Russian, and others. French words like flot, hauben, and girouette derive from Norse. Russian contains Norse loanwords, and many Russian river and place names have Scandinavian origins. Irish absorbed Norse vocabulary, particularly nautical and urban terms. Scottish and Manx Gaelic show Norse influence. Place names across Britain and Ireland reveal settlement patterns: By, Thorpe, Kirk in England, Home, Bicester in Scotland, Wicklow, Carlingford in Ireland. These linguistic traces map Viking presence and settlement, showing not just temporary raids but permanent demographic impact. Language borrowing required sustained contact, bilingual communities, and cultural exchange. The linguistic legacy preserved in millions of speakers' daily speech connects modern descendants to Viking Age encounters, making that distant past present in contemporary language. Fact 91. The Islandingasogur, sagas of Icelanders, number about 40 major sagas describing feuds, romances, and adventures of early Icelandic settlers. These prose narratives, written in the 13th and 14th centuries about events 200 to 300 years earlier, are remarkably sophisticated literature. They feature complex characters, psychological depth, ambiguous morality, and realistic dialogue. Unlike medieval European literature's focus on nobility and fantastic adventures, sagas often feature farmers and merchants dealing with property disputes, family feuds, and social conflicts. The prose is spare and unornamented, letting events speak for themselves. Sagas influenced modern literature, particularly the realistic novel. They provide invaluable historical sources despite being written long after events they describe. Reading sagas gives access to Viking Age culture, values, and worldview, filtered through medieval Icelandic Christian authors but preserving much of earlier oral tradition. Fact 92. The Valkyries, Odin's supernatural handmaidens who chose the slain and served in Valhalla, represent both empowerment and limitation of female power in Norse mythology. Valkyries were warriors, selecting brave warriors for Odin's army, yet served male gods and catered to male heroes. They were powerful yet subordinate, martial yet domestic. Some scholars see Valkyries as projections of male warriors' desires, beautiful women serving them forever. Others see them as embodying female martial power acceptable within mythological framework even if rare in reality. Valkyries appear frequently in Norse sources, with names like Brynhildr, Sigrun, and Svava featuring in heroic poetry. The concept influenced later literature and popular culture, with Valkyries becoming iconic Norse mythological figures. They represent how Norse culture imagined supernatural female power, significant and memorable but operating within male-dominated cosmic order. Fact 93. The climate change that brought the Little Ice Age contributed significantly to ending Viking expansion and abandoning Greenland. The medieval warm period that facilitated Norse expansion into North Atlantic ended around 1300 CE. Temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened, and sea ice expanded. Greenland became increasingly uninhabitable for Norse farming. Ships could less easily navigate between Iceland, Greenland, and Norway. Crops failed more frequently. The settlements couldn't sustain themselves and lost contact with Scandinavia. By 1450, the Greenland colony was abandoned or died out. Climate change limited where Vikings could raid, settle, and trade. The warming that enabled their expansion and its subsequent cooling that limited them reminds us that human history unfolds within environmental constraints. Viking Age coincided with favorable climate. Its end partly reflected climate deterioration that made earlier achievements unsustainable. Fact 94. The Varangian Guard's most famous member, Harald Hardrada, represents the Viking Age's final great figure. Born in Norway in 1015, Harald fought at age 15 at the Battle of Stiklestad where his half-brother Olaf tried to claim Norway's throne. After defeat, Harald fled to Constantinople, joining the Varangian Guard. He campaigned in the Mediterranean, accumulated wealth, and returned to Norway as king in 1046. After ruling 19 years, he invaded England in 1066, claiming the throne. He won initial victory at Fulford but was killed at Stamford Bridge by King Harold Godwin's son. Harold's death marked the end of Viking Age Scandinavian military expansion. His career encapsulated Viking Age's international scope, from Norway to Constantinople to Sicily to England. He died trying to win England through the sword just as Vikings had for 2 centuries. With Harold died the Viking Age. Fact 95. Modern Neo-Norse or Asatru movements attempt to revive Viking Age religion and worship Odin, Thor, and other Norse gods. These movements began in Iceland in the 1970s and spread internationally. Practitioners celebrate ancient holidays, study Norse mythology, and attempt to live by Viking values. However, reconstructing dead religion 1,000 years later faces obvious challenges. Sources are incomplete, Christian-filtered, and sometimes contradictory. Much ritual practice was lost entirely. Modern Neo-Norse religion is inevitably reconstruction and invention, creating something new while claiming ancient authority. Some Neo-Norse groups promote ecological values, gender equality, and community, reinterpreting Viking heritage for modern context. Unfortunately, some white supremacist groups have appropriated Viking symbols, though most Asatru practitioners reject racism. Neo-Norse movements show Vikings remain culturally relevant, inspiring spiritual seeking as well as historical interest. Fact 96. The Viking legacy in warfare influenced medieval European military development. Viking raids demonstrated mobility's importance and ships' military potential. Defending against Vikings required improved fortifications, standing armies, and naval capabilities. The castle building that characterized later medieval Europe partly responded to Viking raids. The emphasis on heavy cavalry in medieval warfare developed partly to counter Viking mobility. Military innovations including fortified bridges, watchtowers, and rapid response forces evolved from anti-Viking strategies. Vikings showed that decentralized feudal armies were vulnerable to mobile raiders, encouraging military centralization. The terror Vikings inspired encouraged defensive innovations that outlasted Viking threat. European military evolution from 800-1200 C occurred partly in dialogue with Viking challenge. The raids that terrorized Europe ultimately forced Europeans to develop military capabilities that would later be projected globally. Fact 97. Viking Age Scandinavia's material culture, recovered through archaeology, shows sophisticated craftsmanship and extensive trade networks. Finds include Arabic silver coins, Byzantine silks, Frankish swords, Baltic amber, Arctic ivory, and goods from across the medieval world. This cosmopolitan material culture contradicts the isolated barbarian stereotype. Vikings were integrated into international medieval economy, trading and raiding across continents. Luxury goods discovered in Scandinavian burials show wealth concentration and social hierarchy. Workshops produced intricate jewelry, decorated weapons, and elaborate textiles demonstrating artistic sophistication. The material culture preserved archaeologically shows Vikings appreciated beauty, quality craftsmanship, and foreign luxuries. They weren't primitives but participants in sophisticated material culture valuing art, craftsmanship, and international trade as much as martial prowess. Fact 98. The debate over Viking women warriors intensified after 2017 DNA analysis of a warrior burial at Birka, Sweden revealed the skeleton was female. The burial contained weapons, military tactics game pieces, and 2 horses, suggesting military status. Some scholars argue this proves female warriors existed, others suggest alternative explanations including symbolic burial or unusual individual. The debate reflects broader questions about gender roles in Viking society and how evidence should be interpreted. Most scholars agree women warriors, if they existed, were extremely rare exceptions. However, the fierce debate shows how emotionally invested modern people are in Viking history and gender questions. The discussion will likely continue as new evidence emerges. Regardless of conclusion, the Birka warrior demonstrates that Viking Age gender roles may have been more flexible than once assumed. And now, our final fact. Fact 99. The Viking Age fundamentally shaped medieval and modern Europe in ways that continue resonating today. Viking raids destroyed some institutions while strengthening others, accelerating political centralization as kingdoms organized against external threats. Norse settlers contributed DNA, language, and culture to Britain, Ireland, France, Russia, and elsewhere, becoming part of local populations. Viking exploration pushed European geographic knowledge, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and North America. Norse trade networks connected Europe to Byzantine Empire and Islamic world. The kingdoms Vikings founded evolved into modern Scandinavian nations and influenced Russia's development. Viking Age cultural achievements, particularly Icelandic literature, preserved Norse mythology and history for posterity. Even Vikings' conversion to Christianity demonstrated their adaptability, transforming from pagan raiders to Christian Europeans within generations. The Viking Age shows how dramatically societies can change in short periods, how maritime technology can revolutionize power balances, and how cultures can be simultaneously destructive and creative. The Vikings' complex legacy, neither purely heroic nor purely villainous, reminds us that historical peoples were fully human, capable of both violence and artistry, destruction and creation, following their own values and interests in their specific context. They were products of their time who also shaped their time, leaving marks still visible across Europe and North Atlantic 1,000 years later. The Viking Age ended, but Viking influence endures in language, genes, laws, literature, and imagination. As you rest, imagine the aurora borealis fading with the approaching dawn over a calm Norwegian fjord. The longships rest peacefully on the beach, their dragon heads removed. The age of raiding has passed. Smoke rises from farmsteads where Vikings have settled, becoming farmers and craftsmen rather than warriors. The old gods fade into memory as Christianity spreads across the north. Yet the spirit of adventure, the love of beauty and craft, the value placed on law and loyalty, these endure. The Vikings transformed from raiders into rulers, from pagans into Christians, from Norsemen into Europeans. Their descendants carry their legacy forward, even as the Viking Age itself becomes history, then legend, then the subject of peaceful dreams. Sleep now, traveler. Your journey through the Viking Age is complete. May your dreams be filled with longships and northern lights, with courage and adventure, with the cold beauty of the frozen north and the warm glow of the great hall's fire. The Vikings sleep now, their weapons silent, their ships beached, their stories told. Sleep peacefully in the long northern night.